Hi, I want to talk about logic because there seems to be a dearth of it in the debates I've been having of late, and also in the videos I watch, many of them, that purport to be presenting factual information. So I can't give a whole course in logic in a 10-minute video, of course, oh well, make that 2 10-minute videos. Sorry. Putting up a link to a site that covers it pretty clearly and carefully, and I think anyone can benefit from refreshing themselves in that subject. This is just going to be a brief overview. There are two kinds of logic. One is inductive, the other is deductive. Now, inductive logic is the simplest, but also the most difficult, because it involves real things, real observations, the scientific method, evaluation of evidence. It is a statement of truth based on observation. So, in a very real sense, we can never have something proven to be true to 100% degree, but we can come pretty close. For example, the statement, the sun will rise tomorrow, is a pretty safe bet based on thousands of years of observation. Now, these observations that are made inductively are often used as the premises for deductive logic. Now, deductive reasoning typically involves a syllogism. It's a formal construct. There are many forms, but the most common one you see as an example is one like all men die, which is the first statement of the syllogism and is called the premise. The second statement would be John is a man. This is called the inference. It's the second statement of the syllogism. And then you have the conclusion, John will die. Well, that all checks out, right? Now suppose we change that around a little bit. Let's say all men die. John is a fish. John will not die. No. Doesn't work. Because there's a disconnect between the premise and the inference. So your conclusion means nothing. And you can play around with this a lot and come up with many invalid arguments. And this is what the whole thing is called, is an argument. So when you're reading something, when you're watching a video, you should be thinking in terms of the syllogism. For example, I was reading an article last week, I think, and I came across a statement saying, it was an article opposed to the overprescription of psychoactive drugs, particularly antidepressants, I think specifically antidepressants, which I happen to agree with from the outset. I'd already come to that conclusion. But it stated something like there are 277 million prescriptions filled every year for antidepressants. Immediately, my brain calls a halt. It says, what does that mean? Even though they documented where that statistic came from, what does that mean? Okay, well, most prescriptions are prescribed in 30-day increments. So that means my first impression being 277 million, well, that's almost everybody in the United States that has a prescription for antidepressants. Well, no, that's not what I meant. That was probably an impression it wanted to give the person who wasn't reading it carefully. But first of all, you have to divide that by 12. And then you have to remember that most people who are taking antidepressants are taking more than one. So you divide that by 2, and you end up with around 10 to 13 million people in the United States that have a prescription for antidepressants. That comes to a little bit more than 1 in 30. Makes a little more sense, doesn't it? That's the way you should look at it. So, I continue to read the article bearing that in mind. We're not talking about 200 million or close to 300 million people that have prescriptions. We're talking about between 10 and 13 million, which, as I said, translates to a little bit more than 1 in 30. So, it's not such a big deal as they made it seem when they put that number in the article, 277 million. This is something you need to watch out for when you're watching videos, when you're reading something. Be wary of the misrepresentation, even if the misrepresentation itself is factual. Now, an example of induction can be found in my video. This is my damn video that I put out on Cobalt des Linde. In that video, I used induction to prove that the video that I had up and was taken down because of a DMCA complaint was in fact my video. Now, having proved that by induction, I used deduction to prove something else. I used deduction to show that a crime had been committed by the person who filed the DMCA against my video. And the syllogism is something like this. Perjury is a crime. This person committed perjury. Conclusion. This person committed a crime. Now, in my next video on the subject, this is my DMCA video, or this is, excuse me, this is my damn video result. I used deduction. I used it several times to prove several points. But in each case, you can check the syllogism for yourself and see whether it was valid or not. And again, if you don't understand the methods, there's a link right there on logic. Now, as to the first video where I proved inductively that it was my video, yeah, you have to accept that what I did was legitimate. And if you wanted to create some kind of convoluted scenario, you could actually discount it and say that I faked the whole thing because if I spent enough money and I spent enough time and I was good enough, yeah, I could have faked it. But it would have been darn difficult. So now you have to remember Occam's razor. Occam's razor is simply a rule. It's an informal rule, but it's a good rule and it's a true rule. It's simply that given a number of possible explanations for a phenomenon, more often than not, you will find that the simplest explanation is the one that is true. An example of this would be finding a puddle of water on your floor. Your first thought should be, in finding out where that water came from, is that it probably came from somewhere uphill of where it is now. Not that, somebody rigged up a pipe system and ran it up to the floor and put in electrical pumps and stuff to get water up under your floor. That should be your last consideration. Same principle applies in many situations. So when you're watching people's videos, particularly ones that purport to be factual, always consider the syllogism. Always consider whether or not the premise is proved, because if the premise is false, the whole argument is invalid. Consider the relationship between the premise and the inference. Is there one, or isn't there one? Remember the example I gave you. And then the conclusion. Does the conclusion follow from the premise and the inference? If it doesn't, it's an invalid argument. In fact, most of the time deduction is actually used to disprove rather than to prove. And that's another thing to be very clear on, is that it's an absolute law of logic that you can't prove a negative. You can only prove a positive. And the reason for that would be manyfold, but one good reason for that is a question of sensitivity and measurement. Consider in the laboratory you're testing somebody for hepatitis. Now, that test comes up negative. Does that mean the person is not infected with hepatitis? Well, having done that particular test many times in my life, I can tell you, no, it doesn't mean that. It means there is a high degree of probability that the person is not infected with hepatitis. But it doesn't prove it. There are so many ways, because of the sensitivity of the test, that the person could in fact be infected, and it just still comes up negative.